Recent interventions of anonymous bear a family resemblance to the political avant-garde of the early part of the 20th century, and are distantly related perhaps to examples of tactical media, but those tend to have a much clearer and clearly disruptive political program. So these are my examples of ambivalent popular cultural production. Remix videos and audios, machinima, flash mobs, lolcats, the hacktivism of 4chan. Each could be related historically to a function of art in the 20th century, modernist or avant-garde. In some cases, the producers see themselves in relation to those movements, but in most cases, I dare say, not. They may not be even aware of the historical narratives of art that their work suggests. And that's important, precisely because they constitute such a huge new creative presence in our media culture. I've been trying in the past 30 minutes to lay out some obvious and yet also extraordinary conditions of our media culture today. The barrier of high and popular culture has long broken down. The master narrative of art in the 20th century is gone. We are left with the definition of art as the shared practice of groups of people. Our media culture has shattered into a seemingly endless number of such groups, and the productions of many of these communities claim to be art, and have some qualities that we associated with art in the 20th century. But they seem to have these qualities often accidentally or incidentally. If our media culture today is a plenitude, each of these communities does more or less the same cultural work. None can speak for the culture as a whole because there is no whole. If there is no single agreed-on center to our culture, then art, and for that matter literature, cannot be at that center, as modernism claimed, as postmodernism perhaps only pretended not to claim. Another way to say this is that we cannot argue for an absolute standard by which lolcats are less culturally important than serious media art. Within a community, within a network of communities of art, for example, the participants may well believe this, but they are inevitably speaking only to and for members of their own community. Thank you. People would like to ask questions, or perhaps we can do that individually. Oh, good.
Well, someone has to start. First, let me say, I want to thank you for a very enlightening presentation, extremely valuable to myself. I do have a question, though, that might help more. You referred to high art and, also terms like serious media art, high art, and I wonder if you might help us understand a little bit better about that. I suppose that would have been a center if we had a center, but what might you say more about the concept of what you intend to convey by the use of the term high art or serious media art?
Well, in a certain sense, I'm using the term against itself, right? In other words, if what I'm suggesting has any validity, makes any sense, then the term high art itself no longer does make sense for our culture. And so what I'm trying to convey by the term when I use it now is either what we as a culture used to call high art, for example, the classical music, traditional painting and other forms of visual art that were accepted into the kind of elite status literature that had been in the canon. Either that or what, in some cases I think in my talk, what I was actually referring to is what certain communities would consider high art today. But yes, obviously the term high art is one that I'm meaning to deconstruct.
Well, perhaps it is now just one of those communities you speak of, too. One might say that. Anyway, thank you.
Okay. I can ask another question? Yeah. Okay, thank you. I was wondering if I could, over here, I was wondering if I could ask you to perhaps clarify something in the sense that you talked about an era that dispenses with abiding definition of art. And I was wondering about how this dispensation of boundness in fact becomes the guiding and grounding principle of art today, as you describe it, in the sense that, ironically, the very idea of dissonance, destabilisation, decentralisation, ephemera, temporality, all of these kind of more slippy terms actually centralises ever more and produce ground nevertheless, which basically returns us to a constant and normative condition where freedom, a concept of freedom, is still our guiding principle. The concept of the uncontainable, for example, in the ICEA kind of title there, becomes the guiding principle of a form of belief in freedom, which does not remove us at all from any of these conceptions of freedom that were inherent to the avant-garde. So I wonder if that makes sense, and if you could speak to that kind of contradiction.
Well, I would, I guess I would be inclined to say that offered as a definition of art might well be convincing or compelling to a large community of artists. I'm not sure if it would in fact be the definition that all artists would subscribe to. But what I was trying to suggest was that even if one could come up with a definition that functioned univocally across communities of artists who are in dialogue with each other, represented by ICEA, we would still have the problem that it doesn't work across, the entire boundaries of our culture. All these popular media communities who are also appropriating the term art, many of them are not taking the the notion of disruption, which is, after all, a feature of avant-garde from the 20th century as well, as a defining feature of art. Certainly Roger Ebert doesn't, right? So I think that what I'm trying to argue is that within the current media culture, we have a situation in which it's no longer possible to find a definition that everyone is going to agree to. And that in addition, we don't have a situation in which there's a membership card in the community of art that guarantees you, the right to make the claim to that definition. In other words, there are these competing communities of some of whom are traditionally thought of as artists, many of whom are not. All of whom seem to have a claim to cultural importance today. So while I think that's a very interesting definition, I don't think it can really replace, say, modernist definitions of art as self-reflexive.
I guess it was just that the condition you described as being the uncontainable, for want of a better word. It seems to me that is a very normative or conservative understanding of art's political agency or critique.
So when you say normative and conservative, is that itself a criticism of the definition, or are you proposing that definition?
I don't see the connection between something that would, this idea of the uncontainable, I see it as quite located and in fact very containable in that sense. Because it has a very clear aesthetic and it's almost like a genre of thought in itself. I guess that's what I was trying to get at.
Okay.
Thank you.
I have a question at the end. Hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very inspiring. Towards the end, you speak of how there's no centres and so on, and then you say something about, if I interpret you correctly, that the meaning now is a meaning within the shared values or the shared ideas within particular communities. And in relation to that, I see a shift actually with, for particularly the example of the flash mob example. Here's if you like, you could call it an artwork or you could just call it an activity. Whatever it is, it was an action that had some effect in a world that was not aware of the rules of that so-called game. And I do see a lot of media activities having that as a sort of mission or goal, and that is to get away, to be uncontainable in the sense of the verb rather than the nominative. And I do see a shift there. For example, these days some people are scientists, but they could be artists, or they could be garbage collectors, but they could be artists, and so on and so on. And I see that actually we're getting away from worrying about what is a definition, but rather just getting busy with activity and making lolcats. And one day it might be interesting and the next day it isn't. So I wonder if you had some more comments on that, because I do think we are moving away from worrying about naming things and just getting out and having fun.
Well, and I think lots of, I'm not sure who you mean by we, because I would agree with you that that's a very common and plausible position today, right? And yet, we also have, as I was trying to suggest, even within the popular world, this rhetoric of art reinscribed that suggests video games are art, that worries about whether, ARGs or other forms that I was suggesting have an artistic function. In other words, not everybody has given up on the notion of trying to come up with a definition, and also the idea of dividing culture into these units or categories, some of which are art and some of which aren't. And what I'm really trying to suggest, and as I said at the beginning, maybe it's obvious, either you're convinced or not, is that we are living in a culture condition today where that activity is going to continue, but it can't be culturally defining across the varieties of different forms that we have. So I think I would not disagree with what you're suggesting as a kind of common set of cultural practices, but I think that we also should be aware of the fact that almost any of these positions on the nature of art will find defenders, and will find communities of defenders that by traditional standards are enormous.
There was yesterday an event at the Biennale, and it was an event where we crossed between, if you want to call it, the community of the Biennale and the ACF community. When I think about the media, art communities, generally speaking, they do not have a recognition from the world of the high art. And I challenge anybody to showcase, beside a few new media art to Biennales, an event, either from the Venice Biennale or from the Istanbul Biennale, where there is a presence of actually new media. So for me, this was the idea of uncontainability. It's the fact that there is a progress, and some of these forms will move on. And interestingly enough, all the crowds of all the different communities, they tend to strive for a recognition and an entrance within the high arts. And they are constantly rejected, and have been constantly rejected for around the past 40 years. We had very little interminglings and very little support for all different sorts of reasons that we sort of discussed yesterday. So what I find interesting is that the communities remain isolated ghettos from which it becomes very difficult to decide a few